on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. UFC 251 over on UFC Fight Island has not one, not two, but three title fights on the card. Of course, exclusively on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. And to join us now to talk more about it, Brett Okamoto, ESPN MMA reporter. Brett, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. We're a day away from some pretty good fights here at UFC 251.
Absolutely. And obviously we got to talk about the main event because, it was just a week ago that we thought it was going to be Usman versus Burns. And a week later, we get Masvidal versus Usman. I mean, just talk about the wild last several days and how we flipped from one to the other in a way that I think a lot of people were wondering, will we ever see Masvidal fight Usman? And we're finally getting what the fans really wanted.
Yeah, that's what's crazy about the whole thing is that this was the fight that should have happened from the beginning, quite frankly. I mean, if you go back to February, which feels like, at least to me, and I'm sure to a lot of people out there, it feels like ages and ages ago, February. But, these two were on Super Bowl row and jawing back and forth with one another. I mean, this seemed like the obvious fight to make. Usman was a champion and Masvidal was coming off of one of the best years that anyone has ever put together in this sport, just in terms of his performances, knocking out Darren Till, Ben Askren in 5 seconds, and then beating Nate Diaz in New York. I mean, it was just everything was pointing to, hey, this was the next welterweight championship fight. But then Masvidal got in a contract dispute with the UFC, and in the meantime, this Gilbert Burns guy went on a run, and the UFC was fine moving forward with that fight. But then Burns tested positive for COVID. When he came to Las Vegas, he was going to get on a plane to Abu Dhabi. I mean, that's how close this thing was to Gilbert Burns getting his title shot instead of Masvidal. But obviously, that test comes back positive, and at that point, the UFC and its fighters, they tend to get deals done in crunch time. I mean, these guys like to jump at opportunities, and the UFC, to their credit, they like to put together big fights that people want to see. So they made it work. They got this deal done within a matter of 24 hours, and now we've got, I think, a much bigger fight, quite frankly.
And also a fight that I think a lot of the casual fans are also going to be attracted to because in many ways, thanks to Masvidal's rise, he has become a superstar on a level that I think a lot of people are going to be more drawn to want to see this matchup because, of his personality, how he talks, his story. I mean, he's the kind of guy that, if you're the UFC, you're even more excited to have him on the card because all the eyeballs are going to be there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it sounds like we're putting Gilbert Burns down, but we're not. And I think Gilbert's even aware of it. I mean, he knows that Jorge Masvidal is just a star. And in the UFC, it's not easy to become a star. I mean, it's kind of interesting that once you become a star, then you're sort of maintain it. You stay one, even if you go on a losing streak. It sort of doesn't matter. I mean, once people are really invested in you, they tend to stay that way. But it takes time, and it takes a lot of things to fall in the right place to reach that status. And Masvidal, I mean, the guy's been fighting for 17 years professionally. He's been fighting his whole life, basically. And it was only last year that he really hit that status, but he has certainly hit it at this point. Like to your point, casual fans who don't really follow the UFC on a daily basis, maybe they were intrigued by Fight Island. Maybe they were intrigued by, hey, there's not a ton of sports going on. Maybe I'll watch 3 title fights. But those casual fans, they're like, wait a second, that Masvidal guy? Yeah, I've heard of him. I know him. I will tune into this. So the card is much bigger than it was 7 days ago. There's no question.
When we look at the actual matchup, we know Usman is a phenomenal athlete. He's got the power wrestling. But what does Masvidal have in his game to be able to, shall I call it, counter what Usman brings to the table, which is a set of tools that are at an extremely high level?
I think first and foremost is experience and fight IQ. Masvidal has fought anybody and everybody under the sun. He's faced every single type of style there is. And he's never really gotten blown out. You look over the course of his career, and this guy, if you backtrack, a year and a half, no one was really thinking that Masvidal was championship material, but everybody knew how tough Masvidal was, and no one had an easy fight with Masvidal. I mean, the losses that he had were tended to be very, very close. So he's just a guy that just knows how to be in a fight, how to avoid taking damage. And unfortunately for him, over the course of many years, he just couldn't really win the big one. He couldn't string together a ton of performances that would really catapult him into the mainstream. But then he did in 2019. So I think the biggest challenge that Usman is facing is he's fighting a guy who will not be intimidated by the moment, who is coming in very loose, who is coming in extremely confident, and who is a really, really intelligent fighter. And he's a better wrestler than he gets credit for. I mean, anybody who thinks that Usman's just going to wrestle Masvidal to the ground, I mean, who knows? These fights are unpredictable all the time, but that's not what I see happening. I think Usman's going to have to bring a well-rounded, full set of skills in order to beat somebody like Jorge Masvidal.
Brett Okamoto joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you're following him on Twitter for all of your UFC and MMA news on Twitter at @BOkamoto ESPN. Brett, the other thing with this Usman-Masvidal fight that I'm curious about is no matter who wins, is the UFC going to give the winner to Gilbert Burns, or is there going to be a situation where Burns might have to, maybe have a number one contender fight? What do you think would be the aftermath of the winner of this fight, who they would face next?
Yeah, I think if Usman wins, then it's back to Gilbert Burns, and that's great. I mean, Gilbert Burns has looked so phenomenal. I want to see him fight for a championship. And if it's Usman, I think it will be Burns. If it's Masvidal, I do not think it will be Burns. And the reason I say that is just because at that point, Masvidal will have reached that rarefied air, man. It doesn't happen very often. But when you are an absolute superstar and your stock is as high as it can get, and you're holding a UFC championship, I mean, you can demand the fights you want. You can call for the big money fight. Jorge Masvidal is not going to go from the year that he had in 2019 and then taking a title on 6 days' notice against Kamaru Usman to just facing the number one contender that again, I say this respectfully, that not enough people care about yet. Maybe someday people will really, truly care about Gilbert Burns because he has the skills and he's an entertaining fighter when he's inside the octagon, but he just doesn't have that name recognition yet. So it's not going to happen. I just don't see Masvidal fighting Gilbert Burns. I am of the opinion that the UFC has got to do anything it can do to make Conor McGregor versus Jorge Masvidal. If Masvidal wins, and he is coming off a situation in which he won a title on 6 days, and he can call out Conor McGregor, and that's a fight that I think Conor McGregor would have interest in because now he doesn't have to go against this big wrestler guy that's going to, take him down for 5 rounds. And Usman, he's going to face a guy that's going to strike with him and Jorge Masvidal. Maybe the two biggest stars in the sport at that point. You could add in Khabib Nurmagomedov. He's up there as well. But you'd have the two fighters who are the hottest right now, Masvidal and McGregor. You got to make that fight if Masvidal wins.
So logistically, if I can just follow you down that rabbit hole, if Masvidal wins, he calls out McGregor, let's say, what kind of timetable are we looking at? Because it seems like the UFC is a train that just can't be stopped right now in terms of being able to keep these fights going, no matter if it's in Vegas or on Fight Islands. But what would actually be a timetable for that? Because I assume that McGregor wants to have a fight camp, and I assume that Masvidal would like a little time to, talk up the fight and promote it. So what would we think about logistically in terms of location and a timetable?
I mean, I think end of the year, but then it also kind of brings into question of, and this has been a topic that has sort of been hovering around this pandemic, is that with the loss of a gate, that's a significant loss. I mean, if you're talking about what I think would probably be the biggest fight in UFC history, I mean, you have that fight here in Vegas, or you have it somewhere, I don't think it would happen here, but Abu Dhabi, with the Middle East, some type of site fee. You're talking about a lot of money that is being lost because you can't have fans in the building for a fight like that. So that might come into play in the negotiations, but I think just from a competitive standpoint, those two would be willing and able to fight each other by the end of the year. And that obviously would be a ridiculous way to end off 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to touch on the other two title fights on the card with you as well, Brett. The fight that I'm looking forward to most, no matter what, when this was announced, was Volkanovski versus Holloway too, because I mean, this was a fight when they first fought. I think a lot of people looked at that and they were like, this was a fairly even fight. And to see Holloway, who people believe was on his way to being one of the greatest 145-pound fighters, to then lose at 145 to a guy that I think a lot of people, the casual fan, shall I say, didn't expect to happen, is a huge deal. So talk about what can we expect from this rematch?
That's a good question. That's a very good question, because Holloway is in a position now that we haven't seen him in a ton, right, over the course of his career. Because he's been so good, he's in a position where he has to make a lot of adjustments. He has to come in and fight differently than he did the first time, because I was of the opinion that Volkanovski was pretty much in control of that fight. Not to say that it was just a throwaway, non-competitive fight, but I just felt like Alex was in control for the most part. So if that is the case, then Max needs to make changes, right? Well, how do you make changes when You're in the midst of a global pandemic, and Max Holloway is taken very seriously. I mean, he's been one of those guys who has been advocating for staying at home and social distancing, and to take this very seriously. So, his camp was a non-traditional one. It wasn't one in which he could really get in the gym with a different bodies and put to execute these adjustments that he needs to make. He's going to have to do those with a very non-traditional camp. So I think that he's talented, obviously enough. He's smart enough. He's young enough to make those changes. But it certainly is a challenge, and that's the biggest question going into this fight. That's $1 million question: is how is Max going to change what happened in the first fight? Because he definitely lost that fight in my mind. So he needs to make changes. Can he do so? Because Alex right now, I'm sure he's got adjustments in his back pocket, and he's got plan Bs and Cs. But it's the pressure to change things is not on him; it's on Max.
Physically, we know that Max is at least the bigger, quote unquote, bigger fighter because he's 5'11". Volkanovski's like 5'6", 5'7". So is that something that Max can use to his advantage a little bit better and say, listen, I'm the taller guy. I'm in some ways maybe the bigger guy. How can he possibly use that to his advantage?
I mean, that's a question that's better answered, I think, by coaches than me. But I'll say just my personal opinion watching the fight. I don't think it's going to make a difference in terms of, where we think like Max could really use his reach and stay on the outside and hit him with a jab here and there. I just think Alex is too good at closing the distance. His wrestling is good. His head movement's good. I think that regardless of what Max does, Alex is going to find his ways on the inside at times, right? So I think the way that Max could use his size is in the clinch, though. I mean, to be able to when those distances close, to grab a hold of Alex and maybe hit him with some offense that's in tight, rather than because that's something that Alex did very well. He landed that low leg kick when the fight was on the outside, and then he was effective when he's pressing forward. So if Max can hurt him, when he tries to press forward, well then it might give Alex a little bit of hesitation to come in, and then potentially he can use his length to his advantage a little bit more. But that's something that I'll be looking for in this fight, is that when the fight is in close, does that automatically mean that the advantage goes to the smaller guy who wants it to be in close in Alex, or can Max kind of turn that table?
And Brett, the third title fight on the card, the 135-pound belt. We will have a new champion this weekend, Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo. And I think some people like myself were initially surprised that Aldo actually has been able to make it down to 135 now multiple times. And Peter Yan is one of the up-and-coming stars at that weight class. So to me, this is really comes down to, in some ways, the old guard versus the new guard.
Yeah, true. And it's a huge opportunity for Peter Yan. I mean, if you can't really draw it up any better. Of course, it would have been great to see him fight Henry Cejudo, but Cejudo retired. He walked away. Maybe he'll be back. Maybe he won't. But you look at this situation for Peter Yan. He's fighting on a card that is, this Fight Island intrigue type card, and now you add Masvidal in there. There's a lot of attention being placed on this card. It's a high-profile card. So for, a guy who, like you said, has been looked at as an up-and-comer, has looked at potentially the future of the division, for him to have his first title fight against a well-established name. There's not many more well-established names in terms of everybody knows how good this guy is, and Jose Aldo. If he goes out and makes a statement against Aldo, potentially knocks him out, and starts his title reign at 135 pounds in that manner, you're talking about a massive, massive opportunity to get him off on the right foot. So I think that's what a lot of people are expecting, quite frankly, is for Peter Yan to win this fight. But hey, man, Aldo's been here a million times. He knows how to win these fights. So that's a very, very interesting one. But it's a huge opportunity for the guy who's coming in, and he's the younger one.
Yeah, on the flip side, the story that fascinates me so much is Aldo, because this is the guy, he wasn't just the king of 145. For those who don't know, Brett, he was dominant at 145 for such a long time. And it almost seems like he's gotten forgotten about. And what does it mean for him if he can be the 135-pound champ years after he had that dominant run at 145?
Yeah. I think that unless Aldo, really goes out and makes a huge statement and then follows that up with more wins in this division, I still think that, his peak and his prime is most likely behind him. Again, this is not, I can't predict the future. And if he's able to win this belt and hang on to it a little while longer, obviously that will mean a great deal to his legacy. But I think it's a way to really kind of really kind of continue to put in the past that loss to Conor McGregor, because that's really when things changed for Aldo, right? And I mean, that's been years now. I mean, it's been years since the guy was on top, the king of the mountain for so long, and then he gets knocked down in 13 seconds by Conor McGregor, and he still has never quite completely come back from that. Even when he recaptured the title and beat Frankie Edgar, just things were never the same. So if he's able to come back and say, I won a championship at another division, I became a two-weight champion, and I did it by dropping down when so many people figured that I would eventually move up. It just continues to kind of put to bed what I got to believe is still the most disappointing and heartbreaking loss of his career, and that was to Conor McGregor.
Absolutely. Brett, before I let you go, and I appreciate the time as always, I found it very interesting. You put the tweets out earlier that you talked to someone from the Abu Dhabi Department of agriculture and tourism, and I thought it was interesting that what they had to say about the arena and the possibility that we could actually see people in the arena for these fights, whereas the UFC Apex was more of a sterile environment.
Yeah, and it would still be a sterile environment. I found that interesting too, because, and it's honestly something that I hadn't really thought of before, but I should have. I mean, you got this bubble, right? You've got this big bubble over in Abu Dhabi, and all these people who are in there have been tested. Otherwise they wouldn't be in there. So you've had, prior to everybody coming over and this thing being up and running, you had a bunch of, construction workers and things of that nature, building this thing and setting up the infrastructure of it. And now what you've got is you've got restaurants, and you've got, the hotels, and you've got security, and you've got all these people who are there in order to make this thing run. Well, they're still there. I mean, they're still in that bubble. UFC has another event coming up on next Wednesday. So all these people are still there. So could you take some of those people and bring them into the arena and let them watch the fights? You absolutely could. Now, I don't think that's going to happen this weekend, because they're being cautious. They're being overly cautious for these first few. But I think as this scenario becomes, it feels a little bit more normal. And even if the UFC goes back in the fall, which there are definitely discussions to do that, I think you could see a situation in which we could have a little bit of an atmosphere that is more used to, that is more like what we're used to. And I've seen some people on Twitter say, hey, I like the quiet fights. That's cool, but I don't. I want people to be there and appreciate them. And I want, if a guy wins a championship, I want there to be some noise around them. I would like that. So just personally. So it's a very interesting concept. It's something that I think is very realistic that we could see happen, that people could be around and be actually making noise during these fights.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I know you'll be following all of that as well as the rest of the month for UFC Fight Island. Folks, follow Brett on Twitter at Okamoto ESPN. Brett Okamoto, ESPN MMA reporter, and as all guests, he appeared on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Brett, always appreciate your time.
You guys, Josh, enjoy the fights, man.